So now it's time for open reproducible research. In this presentation, I would like to talk a bit about what open reproducible research actually means. I will also touch some of the challenges that make open reproducible research difficult. And finally, I will present some opportunities we have to realize open reproducible research. Let's start first of all with a few quotes. The problem is that most modern science is so complicated and most journal articles so brief it's impossible for the article to include details of many important methods and decisions made by the researcher as he or she analyzed his or her data on his or her computer. This is what Ben Marvick said. The next quote is made by Claire Wu. He said that an article about a computational result is advertising, not scholarship. The actual scholarship is the full software environment, code and data that produce the result. And finally, Stark said in 2018 in Nature, from time to time over the past few years, I've politely refused requests to referee an article on the grounds that it lacks enough information for me to check the work. What these statements have in common is the requirement for open reproducible research. But what exactly does open reproducible research mean? Reproducible research, first of all, refers to achieving exactly the same results, for example, tables, figures, and numbers as reported in the paper by using the same source code and data. In open reproducible research, these materials are publicly accessible. There is a similar concept called replicable research. Replicable research refers to coming to similar conclusions based on newly collected data or a newly implemented analysis. Open reproducible research and replicable research are often used interchangeably. But it is important to know the difference. Some even say that replicability is more important than reproducibility. In my opinion, this is a bit of a pointless discussion since both concepts are essential for scientific work. Let's assume you would like to replicate a study. So you collect, for example, new data or you implement a new analysis and you do not achieve consistent results. The first thing you could do is investigating the data and the code of the original study and check whether there are any issues or differences to your analysis. In this talk, we will stick to reproducibility as it is defined here. So, same data, same code. That sounds pretty clear, doesn't it? It actually sounds a bit like reproducibility is very easy and it's much easier than replicability. You just need to use the same data, the same code, run it, and you are done. But is it really that easy? In 2016, Monia Baker published a paper in Nature about reproducibility. She asked more than 1,500 researchers if there is a reproducibility crisis. 38% said yes, there is a slight crisis. 52% said yes, there is even a significant crisis. So in total, 90% think it is impossible to achieve the same results by using the same code and data, which is quite an alarming number. You could say, yeah, well, come on, this is just a wrong or an exaggerated perception. It's not that bad. But is this really the case? In this paper, the authors found at least one inconsistency in half of the articles. You could say, yeah, but this paper is from 2016, it's rather old, now it's better. But is this really the case? This paper is from 2021. Only 9 out of 25 papers were reproducible. 16 showed at least one major numerical discrepancy. You could say, yeah, maybe this is just an issue in psychology, but is this really the case? I also did a study in the geosciences. Same here, only 2 out of 41 papers were executable. The remaining papers were either not executable or produced different results. Apparently, reproducibility is not specific to a certain discipline. It's a problem in chemistry, biology, physics, medicine, earth sciences, and probably in every discipline that relies on data and code. Many researchers failed already to reproduce an experiment. But let's ask the question, why is unreproducible research actually a problem? We are not re-executing the code just for fun. There's a reason behind it. So first of all, providing access to the analysis can help authors and reviewers find errors in the analysis. This is not possible if you just provide a textual description of the algorithm in the paper. Even pseudocode that is an abstract description of the analysis is not enough, since what you implemented might still be different. However, I have to admit that accessible code does not mean that you can also find the errors in the analysis. Code can be very complex. It can be composed of many files, many lines of code, and investigating it in detail takes a lot of time that reviewers usually cannot invest. However, if the code is there, you at least provide the opportunity to find errors. And this brings me to the second point. Reviewers cannot verify the results if the materials are not there. All they can do is to trust what is reported in the paper. And how about alternative parameter settings? If reviewers want to know more about it, it takes quite some extra effort for authors and eventually also for reviewers. So the authors need to rerun the analysis using a different set of parameters. They need to report on it. They need to resubmit the paper. The reviewers need to reread the paper and so on. As I mentioned before, you can try to describe your analysis in pure text, but this is pretty difficult to understand if you cannot see the implementation. So the analysis might not be fully understandable. And this is a problem during peer review, but also for those who would like to build up on the work. And this brings me to the final issue. Not reproducible work is also not reusable. Other researchers need to start from scratch, which takes time and also money. So this way of practicing research is not sustainable. All these problems are known. You could say, yeah, well, this is a problem only of a few researchers dealing with code. But is this really the case? In fact, it's impossible to conduct research. It's impossible to conduct research without software, say 7 out of 10 UK researchers. 92% of the academics use research software, 69% say their research would not be practical without it, 56% develop their own software, and 56 is the smallest of the three numbers, by the way, but imagine that every second researcher produces his own software. This is quite a lot. So reproducibility is an issue for many researchers. And there are actually quite a few selfish incentives to make your code reproducible. First of all, reproducibility can help to avoid disaster. As I said, if the code is not reproducible, it is difficult to find errors. If you cannot find errors, you might publish findings that are simply wrong. And this can have several severe implications. In medicine, it can mean that patients receive the wrong dose of a drug. In my area, in the geosciences, it is usually not that life-threatening. However, I'm thinking of climate change. There are many decisions being made to address climate change. These decisions, well, at least some of them, are based on scientific findings. If the findings are wrong, the decisions might be as well. What makes it even worse is the current tendency in society to deny scientific findings. And publishing flawed science makes it even worse. Reason number 2 is that reproducibility makes it easier to write papers. It might happen that you need to change parameter settings, try out another data set, and stuff like that. This is easy if the code is reproducible. I mentioned the third reason already, so reviewers might have a number of questions regarding parameter settings. If they can access the code, they can look them up by themselves, which saves time for money for everyone. The fourth reason refers to the continuity of your work. It is usually not the case that you write a paper and start something completely different. For example, in a cumulative PhD dissertation, the papers build on top of each other. So continuing the research is also easier if the code is already reproducible. Finally, reproducibility will certainly help you build your reputation. So you are transparent, you have nothing to hide, you give others the chance to verify your work and build on your results. That sounds pretty cool. Still, so much work is not reproducible. Why is that? So what do you think? Why is so much work not reproducible? I kindly ask you to go to menti.com and make a suggestion. So you see the code over there. If you go to menti.com, then you have to enter this code and then you will have the opportunity to make a suggestion. So I will give you a few seconds to do that. So we already got a few responses. People don't publish their methods in sufficient detail. This is certainly a good point. Poor documentation. So if you don't know how to run the code, then it's getting pretty difficult. The data and underlying code is not available. Yes, right. Much work to make it reproducible. So particularly if you consider that at the end of the research process, it's extra work and we don't have time. So I interpret that as reproducibility not being part of the normal work. It's extra work. It takes effort now while the benefits come later. At least the benefits are there. That's also a positive aspect. In terms of service of data provider, extra effort. Okay, this comment does not see the benefits. Because there's error in the code. Yeah. We will come to that later as well. We don't spot our own mistakes. This speaks for peer reviewing source code, for example, but of course we also need expertise for that. It's a bit like finding typos in a scientific paper. It's not a priority. I agree. For many, this is the case. It's too complicated to write. So considering reproducibility from the beginning to the end is quite challenging. Because reproducibility does not get enough attention. So this presentation might be a step into the right direction. There's not information to reproduce the results. Yeah, this is the same like documentation. Confidential, sensitive data is, of course, always an issue of private data. Not all steps have been included in the software. Code is not well documented. Yeah. Lack of proper documentation, same here. The code needs commercial software, right? This is also an issue. It takes extra effort when documenting research and change of context. Not sure what exactly change of context means, but yeah, I don't know. All right, thank you for your contributions. There are several reasons, and you mentioned a couple of them. So first of all, as someone mentioned, methods and data sets are often not available. Another issue is insufficient peer review. Many peer reviewers only check the article and not the code in the supplements because it takes too much time and reviewers are already overloaded with papers and work. So we cannot expect them to also review code. Many researchers also lack the skills to publish reproducible research. For this reason, teaching is one of the most important means to solve this issue. Ideally, it starts already on the student level. So the framework for open and reproducible research training can help with that. So feel free to take a look at that. However, these skills are important at all stages of the research career, including early career researchers, senior researchers, and department heads. But there are more reasons for why so much work is not reproducible. I was actually happy not to read the first one. So first of all, many researchers fear losing their competitive advantage. So this is what nobody of you has mentioned, but in general, I hear that quite often. So what if others publish papers faster based on the materials that you made available? You could solve this issue by publishing the materials at the very end of the research process. Another possibility to solve this issue is to impose an embargo on the materials for 1 year or 2 years or 3 years or so. So you put the data set on a repository, you put an embargo on the data set for, let's say, 2 years. And once this embargo expires, the data will be made publicly available automatically. Until then, it's closed. But once the embargo expires, it's open. This is actually a good solution. Another problem is that preparing code and data takes a lot of time. This is really the case. It might also save you time, since it happens quite often that you need to redo the analysis. Anyway, you could just provide a bit of documentation. Better provide the code as it is than not at all. So documentation was an often mentioned problem in the survey on the previous slide. So if you provide a bit of documentation, then it's already very helpful. Some researchers say that the code only works for a specific case. and this does not worth publishing. But you never know, it can be gold for someone else. Another issue, as someone mentioned as well, is proprietary software or commercial software, particularly point-and-click software. This can only be solved by using open source software, ideally scripting languages like R or Python. Researchers also miss supporting tools. Licensing is also not easy to understand, but universities usually provide support stuff for it. For example, data stewards or research data managers. So the way I presented these issues sound a bit like it's the researchers' fault, but it's not. I don't want to blame researchers. I can even understand some of the concerns. The main problem is that they are part of a system that strongly relies on 3 very problematic pillars. If researchers get evaluated, for example, when applying for a job, promotion, or tenure, then there's a strong focus on how many papers you have published, in which journals you have published, and how many citations. And these metrics set wrong incentives. Those who make these decisions rarely take into account how transparent a researcher has worked so far. For example, how often the researcher made the materials available. So it is not surprising that many researchers think that reproducibility was not yet relevant for them. Why investing effort in something nobody is asking for? It's a valid question. However, this will change. Let me tell you how and why. There are more and more initiatives that have open science on the agenda. The UNESCO, so the United Nations Organization for Education, Science and Culture, released a recommendation draft on open science that requires publicly accessible materials. The European Open Science Cloud is the largest endeavor in Europe to create an infrastructure for sharing materials. The largest funding program in Europe, Horizon 2020, also provides guidelines for open access to papers and data. These initiatives are rather top-down, but there's also an increasing number of bottom-up initiatives. We heard already of Philip Stark, who refuses to review papers that do not provide access to the underlying materials. So reviewers start rejecting articles that do not provide enough information. How can they evaluate a paper if they cannot fully understand it? In the Netherlands, some researchers interested in open science teamed up to create open science communities. So we also have one, our open science community in Twente. These communities create a space to discuss topics around open science, inform about open science practices, and share concerns. These communities are open to everyone, no expertise is needed, just curiosity. I checked the list, so I think there are also people who are not from the University of Twente. So you might check the open science community in your university. If there is none, feel free to organize one. So we have a starter kit for that, and it's quite easy to start your own open science community. So it's actually all about accessibility of the materials, but is this actually enough? As I mentioned before, I also conducted a reproducibility study. I searched for articles that had code and data attached. This is actually already great, and it is not very common. But I wanted to see if providing access to code and data is actually enough to get the same results as reported in the paper. So I downloaded the code and the data that was attached to the paper. I executed the code and compared the produced figures with those from the original paper. What you can see here is one example. On the left, you can see a screenshot from the map that I got from the paper. On the right, you can see a map that I got when I ran the code. And here I also highlighted some of the differences. For example, the reproduced map does not have borders, but they are here in the original map. The scale bar is on the right, and in the original map, it's below the map. Such differences are rather design-related differences. You could say, well, design is not that important, and I actually mostly agree with that. However, the reproduced scale bar has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 classes, whereas the original one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 classes. This is already quite a significant difference. In the reproduced map, we also see 2 points that are not available in the original map. So the actual numbers are also different. And this is where it's getting serious. It's again up to you. Why is that? Why are the two maps not identical? Please make a suggestion. So please go back to the survey. And tell me, why are the two maps not identical? Do you have any ideas? Here we have again the two maps. And I'm curious to hear what you think. Why are the two maps not identical? So the first responses are coming in. The authors edited the map outside the software but did not document the edits. This is certainly possible. Different code to generate the data. Also possible. Different data, different options used to create the map. So maybe the parameter settings, something like that was different. Probably the map for reproduction was created after the publication and either improved or actually had to be reconstructed as the original was not repeatable. This is certainly possible. I will pick up this argument later again. The authors did not record all the steps for using the software. As I said, I just downloaded the code and executed it as I got it. So maybe I did also something wrong. The scale is different. The reproduction was done selectively, catering for a change or context by the researcher. Yeah, I'm not sure what exactly that means. Many reasons you did not run the latest version of the code. Input data got updated. Removed some results. Yeah, could be intentional or unintentional. Different software versions. That's an interesting point. There were dependencies required that weren't loaded. I think we should only consider that maps by comparison, and according to that, they are different because they include different data points. The function has changed because the program used to create the map was updated in the meanwhile. This actually goes a bit into the direction that I also assume, also regarding different software versions. So thanks again for your answers. Unfortunately, we don't know the reason for that. I'm sorry for that. I contacted the authors of the paper and they were also surprised, and I believed them, so we can only speculate. Maybe they were playing around with the parameter settings and lost track at some point. Maybe they changed the code after they inserted the figure in the paper and forgot to update the figure. Maybe the code is work in progress. It could be that they changed the code after they published the paper. Most of these issues are not intentional, but emerge due to the very complex nature of computational research. Maybe the reason is somewhere else. So some of you mentioned already something like software dependencies, library versions, and so on. So we shouldn't focus solely on the source code and the data. Some changes can be caused by something that is called the computational environment. And here I have an example for you. To get a feeling what the computational environment entails, please check the following example. Here we have two Jupyter notebooks that apparently produce different maps. In short, Jupyter notebooks are a way to combine text and code. I will come to that in a bit. For now, just focus on the source code. The two codes of these two Jupyter notebooks are identical. Still, if you run the code, and you can try it out by following these links, so I will send around the slides later and then you can check it. If you follow these links, then you will get to these Jupyter notebooks. You can execute it and you will see that the two maps are different, although the code is identical. Let's take a look at the dependencies, which provide a summary of the libraries used in the source code. Apparently, the version of the matplot library is different. So such rather unobtrusive differences can cause quite significant changes in the output. So apparently, making code and data available is not enough. The versions of the libraries are also essential to achieve reproducibility. I don't know whether this explains the differences in the maps we have seen on the previous slides, but this could be one reason. Last year, we did a little review of 11 existing infrastructures that help researchers make the computational workflows available in an executable and reproducible way. So again, it is not only about making code and data available, but it is also about being able to run the analysis and obtain the same results. This goes a bit in the direction of one-click reproducibility, which is something like the ultimate desired state or standard of reproducibility. To achieve fully reproducible results, all the applications more or less rely on the concept of a research compendium. The idea behind the research compendium is to create a package that includes all materials necessary to reproduce the results. The materials include the text, that is the paper, so the scientific article, the dataset, and the code. These three components can be combined in a notebook, which is based on the concept of literate programming. Two famous examples are Jupyter notebooks for Python and R Markdown for the programming language R. For those who haven't worked with notebooks yet, this is how they look like. We have seen one example already on one of the previous slides. So this is a Jupyter notebook. This is R Markdown. This Jupyter notebook can be run in a Jupyter Lab environment, for example. Jupyter Lab is an interactive development environment. It lets you code, write nodes, include graphics. You can run it in Python, R, Julia, and many others. And on the right, you can see the R Markdown file. So here we have the text, here we have the code. This is a way to mix both in one document. And you can run it, for example, in RStudio, which is the same like Jupyter Lab, but for R. But we've learned that it is not only about these three components, it's also about the computational environment. If the computational environment is not considered, we cannot guarantee that others can reproduce the same results or execute the code at all. This raises the obvious question, which of the applications do consider the computational environment? Fortunately, most applications do. I'm not entirely sure about the three on the left. Many things happen under the hood. So probably they do consider the computational environment, but I just couldn't find information in the documentation. So we cannot say to which degree they consider the computational environment. If it's just about dependencies or also software versions of RStudio, R, Python, or whatever. And how about literate programming? Most applications support at least one literate programming format. This does not mean that with some configuration you can also use R Markdown in one of the applications that only support Jupyter notebooks. But if you look at the documentation of the applications, these are the formats that are supported by default. In the best case, an application supports both R Markdown and Jupyter notebooks. Let's take a closer look at one of the applications. So let's start with Binder. Binder makes it very easy to create reproducible workflows. If you have a repository with Jupyter notebooks or R Markdown files, all you need to do is creating a configuration file that specifies the versions of the libraries you are using in the code. Then you can simply paste the URL from GitHub, from GitLab or Zenodo and create the required environment. In this example, we have an analysis including an R Markdown file, some data sets, and with one click, we can start an RStudio session and rerun the analysis. The application that we reviewed was provided by eLife. So eLife is actually a publisher, but they also have some tools for creating reproducible documents. And this is how an eLife paper looks like. On the top left corner, we have a button to run the entire document. So it's basically one-click reproducible. We can change the code within the document and rerun the code, for example, based on new parameter settings. We can also change values below a figure and then see how these changes affect the output. This is pretty impressive, but as you can imagine, this takes quite some effort and time and stuff. It is thus rather questionable if this is scalable. However, you can also create such documents by yourself if you want to. The tools to create these interactive papers are completely open source and available to everyone. CodeOcean is a different example, a different application. They provide the code and the data below an article as a supplement. And readers can explore the code and the data, but they need to sign up if they want to do more. So there are some basic free options, but if you want to do much more, then you have to pay as well. So the three examples that I showed so far are very different. So the Binder service is for free and not connected to a publisher. Of course, you can do it if you are running your own journal. You can also use Binder. eLife is a publisher and hosts the service, but the software is open source. CodeOcean is a commercial company that provides the infrastructure as a paid service. And this raises the question, which services are for free and which ones are paid services? 3 applications are not released under an open license. This means they do not allow self-hosting and are provided as a service. It is not surprising that these 3 applications are the only commercial ones. It is also not surprising that the non-commercial projects are grant-based, so they receive funding. Why is that important? We might be tempted to say that we can simply use one of the free online versions and that's it. But the free services are online just for testing purposes. And grant-based projects expire at some point and the services will be offline. I do not want to say that we should not use these services, but this of course has huge implications when it comes to sustainability and long-term availability of reproducible materials. So someone has to host an own instance of these services. This could be the publisher, this could be the university or the funding agency. Further relevant aspect for authors is knowing when to use what. I try to map the applications on the research cycle. In short, researchers usually start to develop the idea, then they design the study, they collect data, they analyze it, they write the paper, submit it for peer review. If the paper gets accepted, it will be published and can then be reused by other researchers. The mapping is just a suggestion and an initial estimation. So if you look at these applications and think of applying it to your own research, then you might come to a different opinion. It's just to think a bit about it. So there are some applications that provide a coding environment. So you can use some of the tools when you start analyzing the data. So you can make your analysis using these tools. This is not the case, for example, in Reproducible. Reproducible is rather usable after you are done with the analysis. Then you can package all this stuff in a Reproducible file and thereby make it reproducible. Manuscripts and authoria focus more on the writing part. You can write text, include figures, and add code to these figures. Again, this makes more sense if the analysis is done. O2R focuses on an even later stage of the research process. Here the analysis is done, the text is written, and now it's about making it executable and reproducible for peer reviewers, and afterwards also for readers. Finally, eLife takes action after the paper is accepted. eLife has a team that helps researchers create reproducible and interactive papers. And as you can see, it might be worth considering to use different tools at different stages of the workflow. So you could start with Binder, for example, then use Authoria, O2R, eLife. So I'm not saying that they are interoperable. So it does not mean that when you are using Binder, then you just can switch to Authoria seamlessly. This is certainly not possible. But if you consider reproducibility from the very beginning, then it's much easier to use one of the other tools at a later stage. This research cycle is also pretty well reflected in a workflow that describes how the whole tail application works. So this is also one of the applications that we reviewed. It starts after the data is collected. The data is stored in an external repository, so it's not stored on whole tail. Researchers then start an R project and also need to specify the computational environment, which is good. We learned that specifying the computational environment is important. And this project runs in a Docker container. After the metadata is added to the project, the researcher can upload the R files, but of course you could also create R files in this environment. And in this environment, the code can be made executable and published in an external repository again. And then the whole tail platform can also be used by other readers to execute the code. Speaking about readers, what are actually the needs of readers? So first of all, they need a way to find papers. Once they've found an interesting paper, they need to be able to inspect the materials. They might also be interested in manipulating certain parameters, as it is possible with eLife papers, and see how these changes affect the final output. Finally, they might want to substitute their dataset by an own dataset and see how the results change. All these needs affect the reader's understanding of the paper and the analysis. Comparison is more of a cross-cutting task that is important in each of these steps, so we also check whether the applications support these needs. Many applications support many functionalities, which is good. Execution is, for example, the most common feature. Manipulation and inspection are also very popular. Not all applications provide a search functionality. Substitution is very uncommon due to interoperability issues. And the Auto-R project, for example, focuses also on user interfaces and implemented some of these needs. So on the landing page of a paper, readers can read the paper and at the same time check the analysis and the data. They can also re-execute the code to see if the results are reproducible. Afterwards, they can manipulate individual parameters, for example, using a slider, and to make changes after a manipulation better visible. They also provide a user interface for comparing different figures. So here you can see the two figures on the left, the original figure, on the right, the manipulated one. So you can compare them in a side-by-side manner. You can also use an overlay. Here again, on the left side, you have the original one, on the right side, the reproduced one. And with the slider in the middle, you can move it to the left or to the right and see the changes. Or you can have an overlay. Basically, in this view, the two figures are put on top of each other, and then there's a pixel-wise comparison of the two figures, and the changes are highlighted here. However, the applications also have a number of limitations. So most of the applications provide you with a link to the reproducible workflow. You can copy the link and paste it into your paper. The problem is that some of the applications allow changing or even deleting the materials after you publish them. These changes do not generate a new URL, but keep the old one. And I would assume that a lot of projects are actually work in progress. This example illustrates this issue. So the paper was published on the 14th of July. The paper contains a link to the GitHub repository, but the most recent activity in this repository was on the 3rd of March, 2021. So I cannot be sure anymore that the link from the paper directs me to the original materials. This can be solved through DOIs. So every update generates a new DOI, making it possible to link to the right version of the materials and continuing the work for the next paper. A further issue is that most journals rely on double-blind review, but the applications do not provide anonymous access to the materials. So if you put a link to the materials into the paper that you would like to submit for peer review, they will find out who you are. Unfortunately, none of the applications has a solution for that. The Open Science Framework, a repository for storing research materials, but not in an executable way, solves this issue by generating anonymized links. This is a very simple but very effective solution. Finally, none of the applications provide support for sensitive data, which excludes quite a lot of research, mainly to the disadvantage of qualitative research. I would like to conclude this talk with a few quick recommendations on how to get ready for open reproducible research. So first of all, I would recommend starting with your own workspace. So try to set up a hierarchical folder structure and take a second to name files properly. Second, I suggest learning a scripting language like R or Python, because tools like SPSS and Excel will probably never be reproducible. You should also learn a notebook format. So once you learn a scripting language like R or Python, this step is rather simple. It doesn't take much effort. I also recommend using a software for versioning like Git. What I've not mentioned yet is that many of the tools like Binder and CodeOcean rely on repository-like structures like Git. But the best recommendation I have is that you shouldn't worry, so start small. It will take some effort at the beginning, but certainly pay off for the rest of career. It's a stepwise process, and yeah, let's start small. So that's it about open reproducible research. Thank you a lot for your attention, and we still have a bit of time for discussion and questions. Thank you.